As the Renaissance was beginning to wind down in Europe, you have a shift in eras and the rise of a group of people who began to feel that the Catholic Church no longer spoke for them and for their idea of spirituality. And so we have the Protestant Reformation, which begins in the 16th century and really carries over into the 17th century. So for today's lesson, we're going to look at the impact of the Protestant Reformation, what it was, what the major events of the Reformation were, the response by the Catholic Church in Europe, and in fact, how Protestant ideas moved throughout the world during the tail end of this era. But first, let's review some of the main beliefs of Christianity. Again, these are generalities. We haven't gone really in depth into the beliefs of Christianity, but for the sake of argument, so that we can see why the Protestant Reformation arose, let's go ahead and review. As we've already learned, there are some ideas that the Christians took wholeheartedly from their Jewish tradition. For example, the idea that humans are given free will by God. What it means, of course, is that while humans are given the opportunity to believe in God, because of free will, they can choose not to believe in God. They can choose not to strive for salvation. In other words, they can choose to live a life wholly separated from God. But of course, if that's what they choose to do, then they can never hope to be with God. Additionally, Christian communities across Europe believed that the Ten Commandments were the basic rules for maintaining a moral society, just as they had been back in Moses' time. Now, beside these holdovers from the Jewish tradition, we have the ideals that were cemented as Christianity was diffusing across the Old World. For example, the adoption of the Nicene Creed, which is the statement of faith for Christians, adopted in 325 CE, thanks to the work of those who came to the Nicene Council and were working to establish this foundation of Christian belief. Generally speaking, Christians also believed that the Bible was the revealed Word of God. What this meant is that the Bible should be largely interpreted, not taken literally. That's often misunderstood by modern societies where we think that in the Middle Ages everyone always took everything literally. Well, that's not true. People did understand that this was the revealed Word of God, that it had to be understood in its own context, and so again, you interpret, you don't take it literally. Throughout the Middle Ages, most Christians believe that the goal of human life, the reason that you are on earth, is to achieve salvation, to get raised after death. They believed that if you got to heaven, really what happened is that your soul experienced oneness or togetherness with God, while hell was simply separation, permanent separation from God. In other words, theologically, there is no place called heaven and no place called hell. Our mentality, our idea of that is actually quite a bit thanks to Dante and his Divine Comedy, but rather it's a condition of the soul. Oneness with God, that's what we call heaven. Separation from God, that's what we call hell. Now, in order to achieve salvation, which is also called justification, well, you do that, Christians believed, through a combination of faith, like believing in the Nicene Creed, and good works. Now, good works is a phrase that actually means good deeds that are pleasing to God's eye. In the Roman Catholic tradition, as in the Orthodox tradition, these good deeds, special good deeds, were called sacraments. By the time we get to the tail end of the Renaissance, the Church has identified 7 sacraments. These are baptism, which usually happened at or near birth, reconciliation, which is also called confession, where a person goes and confesses their sins to a priest, Eucharist, which is also called communion. This is the celebration every Sunday or at Mass of the Last Supper, confirmation, one of the last of the sacraments to be adopted, which is where a now adult person affirms that they do in fact want to be Christian, matrimony, again, one of the later sacraments adopted. But matrimony was the promise, a covenant, a sacred promise that 2 people made before God to live their lives together. Holy orders, which only some Christians got to do, because holy orders is when a person, male or female, enters the clergy. So they become a nun or they become a monk or a priest, etc. And finally, anointing of the sick, which is what happens usually when one is very, very ill or near death. And this is very often the very last sacrament that most people experienced. We've already looked at how, through the Renaissance, people were already questioning the institutional church, the services that the church had been able to provide to people. This questioning really reaches kind of a peak during the Plague era. And in its aftermath, you had lots of people wondering what the church could do for them. And beyond that, there were people who were seeking to reform the church, to make it more responsive to the needs of the people. Well, some of these reformers had other questions about the church, and they questioned not just the responsiveness of the church or the hierarchy of the church, but they questioned the very beliefs of the church. One such person was a priest, a monk, by the name of Martin Luther. Martin Luther was raised in the German states, which is actually at that time very far from Italy, and was growing very concerned with what he saw as the growing expenditure of Rome and the bishops of Rome, right? The popes. You had all of this wealth that was being showcased in Rome because it was the Renaissance, and of course, Rome is in Italy. And Luther grew uncomfortable with how much money was being raised across Europe and how much of that money was being funneled back to Rome. So, this in part started his questioning of the beliefs of the church. But he also wondered about other little elements that had been popping up throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. And his goal really was to set these questions that he had before a larger audience so that people could debate them and maybe come to some consensus about what needed to change. Accordingly, he wrote the 95 Theses in 1517. Basically, these were 95 statements of argument where he wanted more information, and he was proposing to debate this in front of that broader audience. By and large, the majority of his theses deal with this issue of indulgences. Indulgences were a special category of deed, good deed usually, that people accomplished as a way or in a way to please God. Now, really, the very first indulgences were given to pilgrims, people who spent their own money and their own time and really put their own lives in danger to go and visit pilgrimage sites, not only throughout Europe, but also in the Near East. They went to visit Jerusalem, they visited Bethlehem, etc. Well, during the Crusades, because so many people needed to pick up arms and go and fight in the Near East, what happened was the Pope offered an indulgence to all of those fighters who would go. Keeping in mind, of course, that murder, killing, is one of those 10 commandments that you're not supposed to do. Well, how do you get around that? What the Pope proposed was that all of those people who took up the cross, who became crusaders, would be allowed to leave their homes, and their homes would be untouched, and they would get a special dispensation for fighting in the Near East. So this would be an indulgence, a sight pleasing to God. That's all well and good, and you can certainly see how, in some ways, that can be interpreted as a good deed toward God. But as we get later on in the Renaissance, this idea of indulgence started getting perverted by quite a few people, and especially this was true in the German states. For example, one of the ways that the idea of the indulgence was perverted was that people started to believe, because they were told this by preachers, that if they had committed a sin, they didn't have to go to the priest and confess the sin, as had always been done. They could simply purchase an indulgence, and in this way kind of sidestep the whole need for penance. Now, here's the deal with confession. When a person commits a sin, they're supposed to go and confess this sin to the priest. The priest listens, and the priest is supposed to consider, based on the tone and what the person tells them, whether or not you truly feel guilty. The priest then can absolve, can forgive the person for this sin, and in order to prove that you were truly guilty and truly deserving of this absolution, the priest gives the confessor a penance. You're supposed to do something. And nowadays, something along the lines of praying a certain prayer so many times. In the Middle Ages, the penances were often quite harsh. For example, a person might be called to fast for a week. They might be asked to wear a certain kind of clothing that denoted that they had sinned in a certain way. They might be asked to do a combination of these things. So sometimes people avoided the confessional because they didn't want to have to deal with this penance. Well, when you had certain preachers say, oh, No big deal. You committed adultery? Pay this much instead, and now you don't have to go to confession. Well, people started paying their way out of sin. As you might imagine, a lot of very religious people, Martin Luther included, thought that this was a horrific perversion of the concept of reconciliation of confession, and he called them on it in the 95 Theses. As you might imagine, the 95 Theses, along with several other pamphlets that Luther wrote, caused quite a big stir within the hierarchy of the church, and it was of especial importance because Luther was a university professor teaching theology, and here he was kind of bringing up these ideas in his classroom. So eventually these ideas made it to the Pope. The Pope didn't like them very much because he felt like he was being attacked, which he kind of was, and so the Pope declared that Martin Luther could be considered a heretic, which usually meant that now civil authorities, kings, emperors, etc., could consider Luther an outlaw. And they could consider heresy treason, which meant Luther could be executed for his beliefs. Now, fortunately for Luther, the new Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, decided that he was going to make up his own mind about whether or not Luther was guilty and should be called an outlaw. And so at a regular meeting of his parliament, his Diet, Charles called Luther to speak up on his own behalf. So in 1521, at the Diet of Worms, Luther spoke before Charles, his advisors, the parliament, the Diet of the Holy Roman Empire. And rather than recant, rather than take back what he had said, Luther affirmed his beliefs and went a little bit further than that, really showcasing that Luther had split from the Catholic Church in certain areas of belief. The main things that Luther disagreed with the Church on was the concept of salvation, of justification. Luther believed that there was no way that a human who was a sinner could possibly do enough good works to get into God's good graces and to get into heaven in that way. Further, he believed that God wasn't the type of God, he wasn't a mean God, who would force somebody to continue doing good deeds without really knowing if he had attained heaven. Instead, Luther believed that a Christian could be justified, could be saved by faith alone. In other words, if a Christian truly believed in the statements of faith that were found in the Nicene Creed, that belief, that true belief, was enough to get them into heaven. So he disagreed with the church now that justification was by faith and good works. In addition, Luther had gone back through the Bible and ultimately decided that 4 of the sacraments that the Catholic Church believed in didn't really have a lot of biblical merit. He felt that there were only 3 sacraments that needed to be celebrated and considered as sacraments. These sacraments, very simply, were baptism, communion, and initially he held with reconciliation, with confession. Eventually, Luther would also believe that confession didn't need to be a part of the sacraments. So Luther was saying, really, not only is he challenging this concept of indulgences, not only is he challenging where all the money is going, he's saying, I don't believe in some of the basic statements of belief of the Catholic Church. In other words, Luther was protesting the Catholic Church, and this is what sparks the Protestant Reformation. As you might imagine, Luther inspired other reformers who also split from the Catholic Church. Now, unfortunately for Luther, who thought that he could really bring all reformers together, ultimately some of these reformers also disagreed with Luther. One such person is Jean Calvin, or John Calvin in the anglicized version, who is not quite a contemporary of Luther's, but he was greatly inspired by what Luther had to say. Calvin was French, and in France, which was overwhelmingly Catholic at this time, even with the start of the Protestant Reformation, Calvin felt that people got the Bible all wrong, and that what they were focusing on were the analyses and opinions of people, theologians, which were wrong, and that a new kind of religious belief was called for. Accordingly, Calvin wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which was first published in 1536, would be published several times throughout his life. In the Institutes, he set out new statements of belief, which were at sometimes radically different from those of the Catholic Church, and different even from those that Martin Luther had suggested. one of the biggest shifts from the Catholic Church, and in fact from Martin Luther, that Calvin proposed was the concept of predestination. This is a tricky concept to understand, and again, in a modern world, we can't really understand it because it seems almost ridiculous. But it's important to note that Calvin was living in a very uncertain time. Lots of wars were breaking out, it was the age of exploration, things were changing all of the time. And perhaps in that mindset, this concept of predestination is comforting and makes a little bit more sense. Predestination is actually pretty simple in definition. Simply, Calvin believed that God had already decided, he had predestined the people who were going to achieve salvation, who are going to heaven. Think of it as though heaven is kind of a finite space and there are only so many rooms, and God has already decided to whom all those rooms belong. That was kind of the concept of predestination. And Calvin believed that the people who were most likely to be predestined were going to be those who were attracted to his very austere, very specific idea of Christianity, which was much more strict than what the Catholic Church had proposed or what Luther had proposed in protest. Further, Calvin believed that these people who were predestined to salvation were called the elect, and they were known as living saints. Living saints because upon their death they were obviously saints, they were going to heaven. He believed that these elect would be naturally drawn to his institutes and to his style of Christianity, and so that's how they could tell themselves apart from others. This map showcases the explosion of Protestant belief across Europe during this time period. Now, first of all, please notice that the vast majority of Europe remains Roman Catholic. So everything you see in that darker gray shade remained Roman Catholic. Furthermore, everything you see in Eastern Europe that says here Ottoman Empire, and of course this part right here is Russia, this is Eastern Orthodox. So in terms of what these people believe, nothing much changed at this time. However, let's look at the shades of red. In that kind of lighter reddish color, what we see is the countries that adopted Lutheranism, that adopted Luther's way of looking at things. Remember, Luther was German, so it shouldn't come as any surprise that the first countries that go Lutheran are in fact in the German states. And then Lutheranism spreads to those countries that are closest to there. So Denmark, Norway, Sweden, which at the time also controlled Finland, and Prussia, which is one of those German states. Calvinism, on the other hand, emerges from France. And keep in mind, of course, that France is a largely Catholic country. So in France, or from France, I should say, John Calvin had to go to Geneva, and it's in Geneva that he publishes his works. So when people are learning about Calvinism, they're learning about it through Geneva. So from Geneva, you have the expansion of Calvinism across Europe. Notice how it heads back into France, it goes north into modern-day Belgium and to the Netherlands. It actually goes all the way across the Holy Roman Empire and hits parts of what is now Hungary, Transylvania. And it also travels across the English Channel and hits Scotland. So all of these areas become reformed, either adopting Lutheranism or Calvinism. Additionally, notice England, that light pink color. Something a little bit different happens in England. At the time that the Protestant Reformation had begun, Henry VIII was the King of England, and he was a staunch supporter of the Catholic Church and of the Pope in Rome. In fact, he wrote a criticism of Luther's 95 Theses and was given a special title, Defender of the Faith, by the Pope. However, by the time we get to the end of the 1520s, things have changed for Henry, and they've changed not really because of any spiritual change that he feels, but because of political important ramifications. Quite simply, Henry has been married now for some time to a wife that has managed to give birth to a daughter who survived into young adulthood, but no male heir. And Henry was very concerned with preserving the Tudor dynasty. He was the second of the Tudor kings. Well, the Pope refused to grant Henry a divorce, and as a result of that, Henry was convinced by some of his advisors who were already Protestant that he should simply go Protestant, and that a new Protestant parliament would grant Henry his divorce. So, in the year 1534, Henry formally created the Church of England, which we call the Anglican Church, which is the inspiration for the Episcopal Church around the world. Again, this was the result of Henry VIII's decision. This contrasts with what was going on in the rest of Europe, where it was kind of a grassroots effort. Martin Luther was a priest, Calvin had also been a priest, and these were kind of the lower class people moving through their new ideas. This was someone from the upper class enforcing his ideas below. Now, if you want the whole story about Henry VIII and his wives, you can all take European history, one of my classes, your junior or senior years, or of course you can look it up and do a little research on your own. But in terms of the Reformation in England, what happened is that the Church of England tries to adopt sort of a middle position between the Catholicism that the vast majority of English people were comfortable with, and Lutheranism, which was really as far Protestant as Henry was able to go. So Anglicanism is sort of a mix between Catholicism and Lutheranism. For example, like Lutherans, the Church of England did not recognize the authority of the Pope over the Church of England. However, like Catholics, they retained a reverence for the Virgin Mary and very much a commonality of the service, the Mass, which still retained all the music and all the liturgy, all the readings, etc., that the Catholic Church had done. So on the surface of it, in terms of looks, nothing much changed. Really what changed was who was in charge of the church and what that hierarchy looked like. Of course, Henry also had to deal with the fact that Calvinism had made it to England, partly through Scotland, so even as he tried to enforce his version of the Protestant Reformation in England, there were other branches of Protestantism making their way to England. For the purposes of English history, the most important of these other denominations is going to be a version of Calvinism called Puritanism. The Puritans of England wanted to purify the Church of England. They wanted to see it become much more Protestant, in other words, much less Catholic. And for quite a while, for the next 200 years, their goal is really going to be to try to get into government and reform the church from the inside. They're going to be successful very briefly. For the most part, people are going to be fairly satisfied with the Church of England and are really going to turn their backs on the Puritans. Because they turn their back on the Puritans, though, many of these kind of hardcore Puritans travel to the Netherlands, where they have a much larger Puritan population, and will eventually, of course, make their way across the Atlantic and land in North America. Now, as you might imagine, the church has to respond to all of these criticisms. They're coming not even just from Luther and Calvin and Henry VIII, they're coming from lots of other people who are establishing lots of other Protestant denominations. The man who becomes Pope in 1534, Paul III, makes it his mission to try to address some of these criticisms and in this way try to bring some people back to the Catholic Church. So the church's response to the Protestant reformers is called the Counter-Reformation for kind of obvious reasons. It takes the form of a new council, which meets every few months over the years 1545 to 1563. The Council of Trent is a meeting of the minds in an attempt to really go through the laws and beliefs of the church, address the criticisms that Luther and Calvin especially had posed, and either change things or reaffirm the traditional beliefs of the Catholic Church. So it took so long because they were only meeting for a few months at a time. But to give Pope Paul III some credit, he did try to invite major Protestant leaders to the Council of Trent. For example, he invited Luther, he invited Calvin. But neither of those men nor their followers chose to attend. So in the end, the Council of Trent was basically a reform of Catholics by Catholics, which, as you might expect, tended to affirm ideas more than it did any sort of reform of the church. I think it's important to note, however, that there were two really important aspects to the Council of Trent that did address the criticisms of Luther and Calvin. For one, there was a reform of the concept of indulgences, and the church put an end really to that practice of selling indulgences that had so angered Martin Luther. They also made an effort to educate the clergy more fully than had been done, which was one of the other criticisms that Luther had about the church. In dealing with Calvin and with this concept of predestination and this literal interpretation of the Bible that Calvin believed, what the Council of Trent did was basically say it's wrong. They completely disavowed this concept of predestination because the church said God gives us free will. That means that nothing can be predestined. And in addition to that, they said the Bible is the revealed word of God, but humans wrote it, and humans are fallible. So we can't possibly take everything that's in the Bible literally. So we do have this decided break between the church and Luther and Calvin, which isn't just Luther and Calvin saying, I don't agree with this, I protest. It's also the church saying, okay, but we're sticking with our beliefs. So it really made firm the Protestant divisions of the Christian church. So in keeping with one of these new reforms that the Council of Trent suggested, which was on education, the church approved the formation, the foundation, of several new societies. These are organizations whose focus was not just to bring people, like-minded people, men and women, together to live in a community like a monastery, but it was also to use these people to educate everyone around them. Now, initially, these groups were focused on trying to bring people back to the Catholic Church from within Europe. So they sent missionaries to Eastern Europe, they sent missionaries to Northern Europe in an attempt to get them to come back to the church. But eventually, these groups are going to be instrumental during the Age of Exploration because they're the ones who agreed to go to explore with the conquistadores in Spain, for example, or the explorers for the different countries like France. They're willing to go because they want to be able to educate the native peoples that are found there. So whether these native peoples are African or Asian or American, they want to help convert them to Catholicism specifically. One of the most important of these new organizations is the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits. They're founded by Ignatius of Loyola, who was a former soldier who'd been hurt in battle. And during his rehabilitation, he read Lives of the Saints, and he became convinced that God was calling him to create this sort of society whose job was to educate themselves really specifically in the ways of the world, but also in the laws and traditions of the church, and then to go out and live among the people and serve the people and educate them. To this day, Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, maintains one of the hardest educational methods in becoming a priest. So if you're going to become a Jesuit priest, you actually have to achieve a full PhD before you're a full member of the Society of Jesus. So still a very important organization, educational organization within the church. Now, as you might imagine, all of this religious upheaval and change caused political upheaval as well. Now, keep in mind that the Protestant Reformation had really started in the Holy Roman Empire. This is an empire that, remember, is a confederation of states. There's no one kingdom, even though it is ruled by one emperor. The emperor is still Charles V. Charles V is a very firm and committed Catholic, and he really didn't like what the Protestant Reformation stood for. So he tried to stop and arrest leaders of the Protestant Reformation where he could catch them. He never caught some of them, like Martin Luther. Now, that said, there were some princes of German states within the Holy Roman Empire who became Protestant, who converted mostly to Lutheranism. And when they did so, they wanted to overthrow Charles. They wanted to establish a Protestant empire. And so you get war, you get battles. For about 2 decades, almost nonstop, Charles is fighting battle after battle to try to keep his empire together. He's successful for the most part, but when you fight a war that long, it takes a toll. And especially it took a toll on Charles's health, but also on the cohesiveness of his empire. And finally, he's persuaded, mostly by his brother, that what he needs to do is declare peace and reach some sort of compromise with the Protestant nobles. This happens in 1555 with a document that's known as the Peace of Augsburg. The Peace of Augsburg basically sets up a situation where a state can decide for itself whether it's going to be Catholic or Protestant. And the religion is decided by the religion of the prince. So if the Prince of Bavaria, for example, was Protestant, then Bavaria was going to be Protestant. If the King of Austria was Catholic, then all of Austria was going to be Catholic. This was a compromise that most people could live with. The only issue was that the Peace of Augsburg only recognized Lutheranism as a Protestant denomination. It did not recognize Calvinism or any of the other Protestant denominations that had arisen since Martin Luther first published the 95 Theses. There were also wars in France. The French wars, there were three. The French wars of religion dealt with kind of internal politics as well as this question of Calvinism versus Catholicism. Now, eventually, those wars, which span pretty much the entirety of the 16th century, are going to end in 1598, and they end when the new king, Henry IV of France, declares the Edict of Nantes, which basically grants freedom of worship to the Calvinists living within the Kingdom of France. So, for the 16th century, you get wars fought for religious reasons, which eventually end in a sort of compromise. But, as many of you know, we often have to return to a compromise, revise a compromise. Well, this is what happens in the early 17th century. The tensions within the Holy Roman Empire, where Lutheranism is recognized but some of the other denominations are not, really comes to a head in the year 1618. And that's the year that the 30 Years' War breaks out within the Holy Roman Empire. Now, while the war itself is really a war about the Holy Roman Empire, kingdoms throughout Europe participate. For example, the King of France sends troops, the King of Spain sends troops, the kings of Denmark and Sweden send troops as well. And the interesting thing about the 30 Years' War is that even though this is supposedly about religious freedom, really what it's about is politics. Because the French kings enter the war on the side of the Protestants, not the Catholics. And they do that because it's to their political benefit to have a weaker Holy Roman Empire. That just makes France stronger. Well, the same is true for the Kingdom of Sweden or the Kingdom of Denmark. It's benefiting them to have a weak Holy Roman Empire. So when they enter in, they don't always enter into the war for religious convictions. A lot of times they enter the war for political considerations. Well, just like the wars of the 16th century, the 30 Years' War ends in a compromise, a treaty as well. This is the Treaty of Westphalia, which is signed in 1648. The Treaty of Westphalia is in many ways a repeat of the Peace of Augsburg, but this time the Holy Roman Empire recognizes Calvinism as one of those denominations that will be recognized from now on in the Holy Roman Empire. So the Holy Roman Empire, already just a confederation, has fractured further along religious lines. And basically what we see is that the southern part of the Holy Roman Empire remains Catholic, whereas the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire is Protestant, whether that's Calvinist or Lutheran. Now keep in mind that this is the age of exploration, so all of this religious and political upheaval that's happening in Europe does have consequences in the New World, and especially in the colonies forming in North America. So many of these New World colonies are initially founded because those people are seeking to escape from religious persecution. Sometimes that escape is from religious persecution against them, and of course the people who are persecuted are sometimes Protestant and sometimes Catholic. It just kind of depends where they're coming from. If we look just at the colonies that England will charter in the New World, what we see is that those colonies in New England are founded by Puritans. These are people who, again, wanted to purify the Church of England. They weren't really welcome in England, so they eventually will come to the New World. And so the New England colonies kind of get this reputation for a very strict definition of Christianity and very strict lifestyle that some of the other colonies don't really adopt. Pennsylvania, which eventually, of course, becomes the U.S. state of Pennsylvania, was founded by Quakers, who were also persecuted in England. And William Penn, who founds this colony, wants a place where he, as a Quaker, and other Quakers like him, can live in peace and set up their own system. The Quakers tended to be more tolerant of other denominations, and so Pennsylvania quickly got a reputation for allowing lots of different people to live there. The colony of Maryland was founded by Catholics who were persecuted in England after a certain point in time. And this was a place where Catholics could come, could be in the majority, and could feel once again like they were making the rules. They were setting up their own place to live. So what we see in this very quick look at the Protestant Reformation is that you start with a genuine desire to change, to reform some of the elements of the institutional church. But what results from that is a separation from that church and the creation of various denominations, all of which claim to have the right way of understanding Christianity. And because this is the age of exploration, and because it's the Europeans who are exploring the world, all of those religious ideas get brought to the New World and are now spreading not just across Europe, but in fact across the world as well. And that, of course, has repercussions for later history, which we'll cover when we get there.